Hi everyone, I'm Susan Mulvihill. Welcome back to my vegetable garden. Boy, it's going to be a scorcher today, so I decided to film this nice and early. For today's video, I thought I would share some tips on growing different types of veggies, especially for those of you who are growing a vegetable garden for the very first time, because I really want you to be successful this year. This is our lettuce and sorrel patch, and I've had it covered with bird netting for the season because I'm trying to keep the birds from pecking on their leaves, which they love to do. Now, lettuce is a cool season crop, and when the weather really starts to warm up like it has, it sends up a central stalk, and its purpose is to bloom and create seeds for the next year. When this happens, the leaves get really bitter, and so it's really done for the season as far as I'm concerned. And so what I'm going to do is pull all of the lettuce that has bolted, put them in the compost pile, and then I have a few varieties in here that are a little bit more tolerant of hot weather, and so they're probably going to go for another week or so. The sorrel is occasionally trying to go to seed, but we just keep picking the leaves. They have a delightfully citrusy taste, and I just love eating it. So it seems to be doing just fine. I'm just going to have to pull the lettuce out that's gone to seed. This is our green arrow pea patch. That's a shelling pea, and the peas are so delicious. We've gotten quite a few harvests off of the plants, but again, as the weather warms up, these plants are basically going to shut down. They'll stop blooming, they'll stop producing pods, and so what I'm going to do probably in about a week, maybe 2 weeks, is pull up the plants, I'll shred them a bit and add them to our compost pile. It's always sad when a crop needs to be pulled out, especially this early in the season, but it's just normal for cool season crops to shut down when the weather gets warm. This is our fava bean patch, and in the UK they call them broad beans, just so you know. And if you look closely, especially near the bottom, you'll see a lot of really large pods. Now, I've been showing you how these plants have been coming along so far in the season, but today I wanted to show you what the inside of a pod looks like. We're getting very close to harvesting them, and I also wanted to quickly explain how you use them in cooking. So here is a fava bean pod. They look pretty weird, don't they? So each of these beans is connected into the inside of this pod, which is lined with this really cottony substance. So here is what a bean looks like. You'll notice this green area that's sticking out of the top. So what you do is you harvest the pods when they're really plump and you can feel the seeds inside through the pod. Then what you do is you take these beans out of the pods and you put them into a pot of boiling water, and when the ends turn bright green, usually within anywhere from 1 to 5 minutes, that's when you stop cooking. And so you'll chill them, and then you basically kind of pop this green part out. And you can make all kinds of great things with fava beans. A couple of examples of ones that I've experienced are you can use the beans, the inside of the bean that is, to make a type of dip for vegetables, and it's really tasty. I've also had fava beans in pasta, and that is delicious. So if you didn't grow them this year, I hope you'll try growing them next year because they are the coolest thing ever and very tasty. How are your tomato plants coming along? I hope they're doing great. So mine are finally kicking it into high gear. This bed has the Chef's Choice orange slicing tomato, which I love. And the important thing with tomatoes is to keep them from sprawling on the ground. And that's because, first of all, if you have them on the soil surface, tomatoes can get different types of diseases passed from pathogens that are in the soil. So that's an important reason. Another thing is that the more air circulation they have around the fruits and the more sunlight that hits the fruits, the better they will ripen. So what I've got here is this grid of wire that is 4 feet tall by 8 feet long, And what I've been trying to do is sort of weave the plants in and out of this grid for support. But I do also occasionally take some twine and I'll run it along the outside to pull canes or branches back in so that they stay upright. So if you haven't reined yours in lately, take a look at them and make sure that you keep them growing upright, because you'll be rewarded with lots of wonderful ripe tomatoes. This is one of our onion beds, and what's growing in it is Stuttgarter, which was an onion that I grew from sets. And if you look at them closely, you'll notice they are planted very close together. And that's okay, that was on purpose. But what we're starting to do now is to harvest every other onion in the beds so that what's remaining in the beds will have more room to grow a larger bulb. And the great thing about onions is you can harvest them all season long. You can pick them as green onions, you can pick them as small onions for use in cooking, and you can leave some to grow large bulbs that you can store over the fall and winter months. This is our summer squash bed, and on the front side I've got regular zucchini growing that are the bush form, and the variety is called Clarimore. But on the back side, using the same type of a wire grid like with the tomatoes, I'm growing trombone zucchini. This is called Trombetta di Albenga, and it is a very unusual squash that grows on a vine. So you can see I'm training it up this grid. You can see there's two here, and they will get quite large. What I love about them is they taste like artichoke hearts. So I grow them every single year, and if you didn't have the opportunity to grow them this year, I heartily recommend it for next year. The seeds came from Renee's Garden Seeds. And when you harvest them, they will be quite large, maybe like a foot or more long. They stay quite tender, and I cannot recommend them enough because they are so delicious. Here's that pole bean arbor again. And for those of you who are tuning in for the very first time, I'm growing Musica pole beans on a series of trellises that form an arbor up and over a pathway in my garden. And this works great. But the thing I wanted to point out today is that whether you're growing bush beans or pole beans, make sure you harvest the beans while they're young and tender. If you leave them on the plants longer, they're going to be tough. But the other thing is, if you leave them on the arbor for a long time, what happens is that they start forming seeds, and that sort of shuts down the plants. So make sure you harvest them frequently and while they're tender. You might recall that we're growing potatoes in grow bags, and that's a great way to expand the footprint of your garden without having to make new beds. Now, I wanted to point out two things. Not all potato plants will flower, but if yours do, that's an indicator that you can sneak a few potatoes out of the grow bag or the bed that you're growing them in, and new potatoes are delicious. But the other thing I wanted to point out is a lot of times what will happen is if the plants bloom, the flowers will turn into what looks like mini green potatoes. Do not harvest them or eat them because they are poisonous. So naturally, the potatoes that you grow down in the bag, in the soil, those are certainly edible, but the little mini potatoes or seeds or whatever you want to call them, they are not edible. You'll recall from a previous video that I use a support system around my corn patch. That's mainly because they're growing in raised beds, and so they don't have a ton of soil around the base, and they have very stubby roots. But just as a recap, what I do is I put posts around the perimeter of the bed, and then I run jute twine around the perimeter. We live in a windy area, and so the whole point of this is to just allow the plants to move a little bit in a windstorm and not all the way over and snap, which is awful. So I've got everything in place. We did have a windstorm the other day and everything came through it just fine. Now I want to show you something about the ears of corn that are developing. So here's an ear of corn, and you probably wonder, how do I know when they're ripe? So first of all, these are the silks, and at first they start out real sort of fresh and green, and then they start drying up. Well, when this is brown and it's just papery dry, that's a very good sign. Another thing you can do is feel on the top part of the ear. It should feel rounded, and that usually means that all of the kernels have filled out on the ear. The last thing you can do if you really aren't sure is you can carefully peel back a leaf or two just to the top of the ear to see if it looks like the kernels have formed. My last tip has to do with growing vining things like melons or winter squash. And what you're looking at is one of our melon patches. It's doing really great. You can see a ton of flowers on it. But once I see that there are some small melons growing on them, or if I'm looking at the winter squash and I see that there's a couple of winter squash growing on each vine, what I do is one of two things. I either pull off the flowers on the vines that are past the melons or the squash so that the plants really focus their energy on maturing those melons or squash. Or the other thing I will do is I'll trim back the vines a bit so that there isn't so much leaf area. But the important thing to remember is that leaves conduct photosynthesis, and that is the way that plants get their energy to grow and especially to develop and mature fruits. So I don't want to take much off, but those would be two things you could do. You could either be diligent about pulling off any types of flowers once you have some melons or squash growing, or you could trim back slightly the vines, and that way they really will work at maturing those fruits. Okay, that's the garden report for now. I hope it was useful. I'll see you next week. Happy gardening.